Good evening. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to be learning with you on a Sunday night. We've got a great daf tonight. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we gather to learn on a Sunday? Getting this week going in style. Stephen in New Hampshire, Pauline in Arkansas, Shandora in the Bronx, James in Indianapolis, Yehudit in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Christo in Lubbock, Renee in Indiana, Nancy in North Carolina, Melissa in New York, Bella in Venice, John in Sedona, Paula in the Great Northwest, Harold in Oregon, Lucy in Minnesota, Guy in Ohio, Heather in Kansas, icy cold Kansas, Tina in Tampa Bay, Florida, Hannah in New York, Paula loves the music. That was the song Oof Do Ye by Eitan Katz. We love Eitan Katz around here. Bill in mid-Missouri, Paula in Chicago, Sharon in New Jersey says, today marks 11 years since the passing of the great Debbie Friedman. May her neshama have a great aliyah and her memory always be for a blessing. Tammy in Nashville, Tennessee, over there on the YouTube side. Aoife checking in from Florida. Hello, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Craig and Joan Simon in memory of Harriet and Henry Simon and Abraham Shapiro. May their memories always be for a blessing, and may their souls have a great elevation in the world of souls. May the merit of our learning tonight accrue to them and lift them even a little bit higher. Craig, thank you so much for enabling us to share more Torah with more people. Craig and his daughter are really special people who host an amazing dinner every year at APAC, where I had the privilege and honor of meeting them and their friends. Let's hope APAC gets back on track one of these years soon. APAC was canceled 2 years in a row because of COVID, but that dinner is so amazing. They gather all these, people from around the world who have only in common that they're Jews, or not even necessarily Jews, but attending the APAC conference in Washington, and just sharing our personal stories and forming new friendships. An amazing, amazing dinner. It's a privilege to know you, Craig, and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and we say Amen. Tonight's daf is really cool. We're going to have an opportunity with this first question about whether we may sell a Torah scroll in order to purchase another Torah scroll, and just engage in like a beautiful line of Talmudic reasoning. It's almost like this is a live stream where we're going to have a stream of Talmudic logic that is just beautiful. It's really fun. And some other cool subjects tonight as well. This is Daf Chaf Zayin, page 27, here in Tractate Megillah, the 11th volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 4 tonight, completing our discussion of Mishna number 1 in chapter 4, opening and closing Mishna number 2, and beginning our discussion of Mishna 3, which has some really beautiful and colorful teachings in it. All right, so the flow is... here in chapter 4, we open Mishnah number 1 was all about can we sell the town square or even a synagogue, a place that has acquired sanctity because people pray there. Can we sell it? Yes, under certain conditions. But when you sell something that has inherent sanctity, okay, so now the money that you receive becomes consecrated, and you can only use it to purchase something that is also of sanctity. Higher sanctity, for sure, you can do that. Can you use it to purchase something of equal sanctity? We've been saying, yes, it has to be equal or greater sanctity. Now we're going to really examine this question. Can you purchase something of equal sanctity? Because in matters of sanctity, we always want to ascend, right? That's why we light more candles each night of Hanukkah. So, on Hanukkah, we don't light the same number of candles, right? Each night, a greater number of candles. Well, if we sell a Torah scroll and use the proceeds to purchase another Torah scroll, we didn't increase sanctity, right? We sort of used the proceeds of something to buy something of equal sanctity. Is this going to be permitted? It becomes a fascinating question. Let's get into it. So we started page 27 yesterday. We pick it up a few paragraphs down from the bottom of 27a. So the Mishna states, however, if they sold a Torah scroll, they may not use the proceeds to purchase scrolls of the prophets and the writings, later sections of the Bible, which are understood to have a slightly lower level of sanctity than the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses. Similarly, the proceeds of the sale of any sacred item may not be used to purchase an item of a lesser degree of sanctity. So a dilemma was raised before the sages. What is the law with regard to whether it is permitted to sell an old Torah scroll in order to purchase a new one? Right? So an old Torah scroll, it became disqualified. Some of the ink was smudged that couldn't be repaired. We're going to have to retire that Torah scroll. Well, may we sell it to somebody who desires to have that Torah scroll? Maybe it's not disqualified. Maybe it's just old, and this synagogue would like to have a new, bigger, better Torah scroll. Okay, can they sell it and use the proceeds to purchase a new Torah scroll? That's our question. And the Gemara explains the 2 sides of the dilemma. On the one hand, since the proceeds are not raised to a higher degree of sanctity by doing so, maybe it is prohibited. Or perhaps in this case, since there is no possibility of raising it to another higher degree of sanctity, since that's the highest, a Torah scroll is the most sacred thing in Judaism, it seems well and it should be permitted. Which is it? Come and hear a resolution to this dilemma from the Mishnah. However, if they sold a Torah scroll, they may not use the proceeds to purchase scrolls of the prophets and the writings. One may infer it is only scrolls of the prophets and the writings that one may not purchase with the proceeds, but to purchase a new Torah scroll with the proceeds of an old Torah scroll, it seems well and permitted, right? The Gemara rejects this proof. The Mishnah discusses the law that applies only after the fact that a Torah scroll was sold. Perhaps it is only in that case where, okay, they sold it. What are they going to do with the proceeds? We're going to tell them you have to buy another Torah scroll with it. But ab initio, before you sold it and they come and ask permission, can we sell this Torah scroll to buy a new Torah scroll? Maybe the answer is no, you may not sell that Torah scroll. When the dilemma was raised to us, it was with respect to permitting the sale of one Torah scroll in order to purchase another ab initio. Maybe we can't do it ab initio. Come and hear a resolution to this dilemma from a Baraisa. A Torah scroll may be rolled up in wrapping cloths, right? So the question we're asking, can you sell an old Torah scroll and use the proceeds to buy a new Torah scroll? We're going to try to develop a proof, an answer to that question from a related law. A Torah scroll may be rolled up in wrapping cloths that are used for scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah, right? So in ancient times, sometimes they had a Genesis scroll and an Exodus scroll and a Leviticus scroll. Not an entire Torah, but just one of the 5 books. Okay, that is going to be understood to possess a lesser degree of sanctity than in a complete Sefer Torah. So a scroll may be rolled up in wrapping cloths that were used for the scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah. It can go from a wrapping cloth for one of the 5 books up to a complete Sefer. Now that wrapping cloth is going up in the sacredness of what it's going to be used for. And scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah may be rolled up in wrapping cloths that are used for the scrolls of the prophets or the writings, one of the 5 books of Moses. Higher degree of sanctity than a book from the prophets, like Jeremiah or Isaiah, or from the writings, Psalms or Proverbs, since in each case the wrapping cloths are being used for something with a greater degree of sanctity. However, A scroll of the prophets or writings may not be rolled up in wrapping cloths that are used for scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah. And the scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah may not be rolled up in wrapping cloths that are used for a complete Sefer Torah, right? So the wrapping cloths can't go down in sanctity, they can only go up. And the Gemara explains how this is a proof to our question, may we sell a Torah scroll and use the proceeds to buy a new Torah scroll? In any event, the Baraisa is teaching a Torah scroll may be rolled up in wrapping cloths that are used for scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah. And from this, one may infer a Torah scroll may be rolled up only in wrapping cloths that are used for scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah. But to roll it up in wrapping cloths of another Torah scroll, no. You couldn't take the wrapping cloth of one Torah scroll and use it for another Torah scroll. It would not be going up in sanctity, and so perhaps that would be prohibited, right? Because we didn't have that particular transfer from one Torah scroll to another. It wasn't mentioned in this Baraisa, and maybe we need to infer that if it goes up, it's permitted, but if it's staying on the same level, no, it's prohibited, perhaps. And the Gemara rejects this proof. If this inference is valid, one should be able to say the latter clause and make a similar inference from it. And the latter clause teaches, and scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah may not be rolled in wrapping cloths that are used for a Torah scroll. And from this it may be inferred that it is prohibited only to roll up scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah in wrapping cloths that are used for a Torah scroll. But to roll up one Torah scroll with the wrapping cloth of another Torah scroll, that would seem to be okay. Right? So the inference that you can only go up, you can't go down, and therefore you can't go across on the same level, it's not a valid inference, because we might draw the same inference that, well, you can't go down in sanctity, but you can stay on the same level. So we don't have a proof yet. We don't have a principle yet about going on, sort of staying on the same level of sanctity. And rather, perforce, one must conclude that no inference beyond its basic meaning can be deduced from the Baraisa, as those inferences are contradictory. So let's try a different kind of proof. Come and hear a resolution to this dilemma: can we sell a Torah scroll and use the proceeds to buy another Torah scroll? From the Toscefta. So the Toscefta, right? So this is that first layer of commentary on the Mishna by the sages of the Mishna themselves. A Torah scroll may be placed upon another Torah scroll, and a Torah scroll may be placed upon scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah. This is related to an idea that we still have. If you've got a bunch of books on a table and you need to kind of make piles, which goes on top, right? So a Torah, like a Chumash, that's just the 5 books of the Torah in a book form, that goes on top of a Tanakh, a Bible, right? And the Tanakh goes on top of a Siddur, a prayer book. And a prayer book is going to go on top of just a book of Machshava, sort of Jewish ideas and Jewish philosophy. And that's going to go on top of a book of just a novel, right? So this idea of increasing layers of sanctity is which books go on top. And likewise with scrolls. So a Torah scroll may be placed upon another Torah scroll. It may be placed on top of just a single book, a single scroll of one of the 5 books of Moses. And scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah may be placed upon scrolls of the prophets or the writings. However, scrolls of the prophets or writings may not be placed up on top of scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah. And scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah may not be placed upon a complete Torah scroll. And from the first clause, it is apparent that one Torah scroll may be used for the sake of another. You can rest a Sefer Torah on top of another Sefer Torah. So therefore, we might be able to infer from that you could sell one Torah scroll and use the proceeds to buy another Torah scroll, because one Sefer Torah may be used for the benefit of another Sefer Torah. But the Gemara rejects this proof. Can you say a proof from the law of placing one Torah scroll upon another? The law of placing scrolls upon one another is different, because it is impossible to place them in any other way, as they must be laid on top of one another when placed in the ark. Now, to the modern synagogue goer, the modern shul goer, you're like, what are you talking about? The ark at the front of the synagogue has stands for each of the Sefer Torahs, and they stand there. No, there's not that one Torah is on top of another. They're all standing independently in place. But I think what we're learning from this is that in ancient times, an ark was a little bit of a different thing, and it was more like, ancient libraries where they had scrolls resting one on top of each other on shelves, as it were. And so in such a situation, you could rest one Torah on another. You would have to rest one Torah on top of another. As if you do not say so, that it is indeed permitted when in an unavoidable situation, well, then how could we furl a Torah scroll at all? Does one sheet of parchment not rest upon another? I mean, when you roll up a Torah, you have words of the Torah, sheets of the Torah on top of other sheets of the Torah. Otherwise, you could never roll up a Torah scroll. It has to be that way. Rather, since it is impossible to furl the scroll in any other way, it is permitted. And here too, since it is impossible to place the scrolls in the ark in any other way, it must be permitted. But from that, we don't learn that we can therefore sell a Torah scroll and use the proceeds to buy another Torah scroll. We don't have an answer to our question yet. Come in here a resolution to this dilemma from a different Baraisa. As Rabba Bar Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, a person may not sell an old Torah scroll in order to purchase a new one. Well, I mean, that seems to answer our question right there, though. Boom, they said it. Our sages said what the law is, and the Gemara rejects this proof. There, in the case of the Baraisa, it is prohibited because of a concern for negligence. The old one might be sold, and a new one never bought, in which case that money that was consecrated when a Torah scroll was sold, and the sanctity, that Torah scroll doesn't stop being sacred, it's a Torah scroll, but that money that was exchanged for it still acquires sanctity, and you have to use it to buy another Torah scroll. But there's a concern that something will come up, conditions will change, people will move, people will die, people will be replaced. Who knows what's going to happen? And now that you sold it, and then that money doesn't get used to buy the new Torah, it's going to be a big Hilul Hashem. It's going to be a desecration of the name. And that's why they prohibited it. However, what we're talking about is a case where the new scroll is already written and waiting to be redeemed immediately with the proceeds of the sale. And therefore, the question remains, what is the law in this case? We don't have the concern that it might be sold and the money never gets used because the new one is sitting there right now. And we're just saying, okay, we want to sell that one, immediately buy that one. Okay, can we do it? We don't have an answer yet. Come in here a resolution to this dilemma from a different Baraisa. As Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Meir, a Torah scroll may be sold for money only if the seller needs the money in order to study Torah or to marry a woman. These are the only two situations when a Sefer Torah may be sold for money, and they do not include selling it to buy a new Sefer Torah. They only include to use the proceeds for the study of Torah, right, to fund the yeshiva or to pay the tuition of somebody who's going to be studying Torah or to feed Torah scholars, etc., but it's going to directly fund Torah study. Or marriage. Isn't that interesting? That seems to be so far afield. But it's saying that the only way for this Torah scholar to get married is to provide a dowry so that he can get married, then it's going to be permitted. But to replace the Torah scroll, no. Learn from this Baraisa that exchanging one entity of Torah, i.e. a Torah scroll, for another entity of Torah, i.e. Torah study, seems well. And by extension, it should be permitted to sell one Torah scroll to purchase another. Now they're saying, well, if you're saying that you can sell a Torah scroll to fund Torah study, well, that's, in a sense, exchanging one kind of Torah for another kind of Torah. So therefore, it should be permitted to sell a Torah scroll in order to purchase a new Torah scroll. But the Gemara rejects the proof. Perhaps Torah study is different, as the study of Torah leads to action, i.e., the fulfillment of the mitzvahs, of the commandments. And perhaps it is only due to its great importance, to the great importance of Torah study, that it is permitted to sell a Torah scroll for it. This is a very beautiful teaching, right? The Torah is the holiest object, that at the end of the day, holy as it is, it's just an object. And the real purpose of the Torah is that people learn from the Torah, and that through their learning, they should come to love and fear God and fulfill their obligations that are stated in the Torah. That's the highest, right? And that's why we learn every day in the morning prayers, these are the precepts, the laws that one who fulfills them enjoys a reward in this world, and the principle remains for him in the world to come. And these are the sort of the most important mitzvahs: honoring one's parents, attending to the sick, dowering the bride, burying the corpse, etc., attending a funeral, and a few others like that. And then it says at the end of that list, and the study of Torah is equivalent to them all. Why? Because it leads to doing all of those things. Okay. And similarly, marrying a woman is also of the utmost importance, as it is stated with regard to creation, Isaiah 45:18. He, meaning God, created it not as a waste. He formed it to be inhabited. He created this universe to be inhabited, right? And that's why we have the obligation, and it's the first commandment in the Torah, Piru Urevu, right? That you shall multiply, you shall bear, you shall multiply. What is it? I always talk about, bearing fruit and multiply is not the same, right? A person is obligated to bear fruit in this world, means that they should fulfill their mission. They should give to the world that unique thing that only you can give, and you should multiply, right? If at all possible, you should have children. And a man, it's interesting, a woman is not obligated. This is an obligation on the men. Why? Why is a woman not obligated to bear children and a man is? Because when a woman bears children, her life is endangered, right? Especially in ancient times, it could happen that in childbirth, a woman would die. And therefore, God would not obligate women to do something that would endanger them. But a man is not endangered when, he's going to bear fruit and multiply. So it's an obligation on the man. And according to Beis Shammai, you don't fulfill that obligation until you've had 2 boys. According to Beis Hillel, and the law follows Beis Hillel, man is obligated to keep trying to bear, to bear fruit and multiply until he has both a boy and a girl. Obviously, it's not possible for everybody to do that for various circumstances that come up. And that's why I think it's so nice to think that bearing fruit is an obligation that everyone can fulfill no matter what their circumstances, because they can ask themselves, what is my mission? What was I sent into this world to do? At any rate, the point here is that getting married is a condition to having children. And if the only way for you to get married is to sell the Torah, the Sefer Torah, yes, that is permitted. But does that it sort of give us a proof that you could sell a Torah scroll and use the proceeds to buy another Torah scroll? We're not there yet, right? So what is the law? Selling a Torah scroll. It is prohibited to sell a Torah scroll. It is prohibited. This law applies only to scrolls that were made to be read in public. But it is permitted to sell scrolls that were written for individuals, right? So a Sefer Torah that was purchased by a synagogue for the purpose of it being read in public, that Sefer Torah may not be sold for money. If it was a private Torah, okay, then you could sell it. However, even in such a case, right? Even in such a case, so even an individual who owns a Torah may sell it. But if he does sell it, one will not see any blessing from the proceeds. This applies even if one has many Torah scrolls and even if he has almost no food to eat. It is also prohibited to sell a Torah scroll to buy a new one. However, it is permitted to sell a Torah scroll in order to use the proceeds for the study of Torah if one has nothing else to sell. It is also permitted to sell a Torah scroll in order to free captives, right? To save lives and to save people from imprisonment. And in order to get treatment for a dangerous illness, pikuach nefesh, to save a life, you could do almost anything. In these cases, selling a Torah scroll is permitted not only when the people in need are one's family, but to help anyone who has these needs, and doing so is a great mitzvah. But if you don't need the proceeds to study Torah, to get married, to save someone's life, to redeem them from being kidnapped and being to ransom them, or to save someone through medical treatment, if it's not going to be for one of those things, if you're just selling it, so that you just get the money that you need for a business venture, to buy a house or something like that, something important, but not at that exalted level, then don't bother, because you will never see blessing from that money. Somehow it won't go right. Basically, we invest in Torah scrolls for the purpose of, elevating that money to the highest degree of sanctity, and there it stays. You can give away a Torah scroll, but you can't sell it, right? Except in those very few exceptions. And on the same topic, the sages taught in a baraisa, a person may not sell a Torah scroll even if he does not need it. Furthermore, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, even if a person has nothing to eat, and out of his need he sold a Torah scroll, or he sold his daughter to be a maidservant, he never sees a sign of blessing from the proceeds of either sale. If you have nothing to eat, go beg for money. But don't sell a Torah scroll, and God forbid, don't sell your daughter into slavery, because it will not solve your problems. That money will not end up feeding you. Find some other way to feed yourself. Clearly, it is never appropriate to sell a Torah scroll for any purpose. And the Mishna states, and similarly, the same limitation applies to any surplus funds from the sale of sacred items. We started to talk about that yesterday. Okay, so you sold something in a permitted way. You're going to use the proceeds to buy something of higher sanctity than the thing you're selling. But let's say that the thing of higher sanctity that you're going to buy costs less than what you received when you sold a thing of lower sanctity, right? You're going to sell a scroll of the prophets in order to purchase a Sefer Torah, and somehow the Sefer Torah ends up being cheaper than the scroll of the prophets. So now you have excess funds. What are you going to do with them? So the same limitation applies to any surplus funds from the sale of sacred items. And Rava said they taught that the surplus funds have sanctity only in a case where the community sold a sacred object and then used the proceeds to purchase something with a greater degree of sanctity, and there was money left over. However, if the community collected money from its members in order to purchase a sacred object, and there was extra money left over beyond the price of the object, that extra money is permitted to be used for any purpose, as the money was never sanctified, right? It's different if you sold a sacred object and you're going to use those proceeds to purchase a different sacred object of higher sanctity. There was extra money. Okay, you sold a sacred object to get that money, so that money has sanctity. And you can only use, and all of that money has to be used for sacred purpose. But if you collected money in order to purchase a sacred object, and you collected more money than you needed, okay, well then the money that you collect, you spend what you need to buy that sacred object. The leftover of that, it was designated for a sacred object, but it never was used to purchase a sacred object, so it never really attained that sanctity. And Abaye raised an objection to Rava from a baraisa. In what case is this statement of the Mishnah said about surplus funds? When they did not explicitly stipulate that they would do what they would do with the surplus, when they did not explicitly stipulate that they would do with the surplus funds as they see fit. However, if they made such a stipulation, then even to use the money for a duchsusia is permitted. You can even use the money for a duchsusia. What is a duchsusia? It's kind of a fun word to say. We're going to define it in a moment. We haven't defined it yet. And Abaye explains the challenge. What are the circumstances of this stipulation? If we say that they sold a sacred object, and after using the proceeds to purchase another sacred object, there was money left over, well, then even when they made a stipulation of what use is it, how can a stipulation desanctify the money? It's the proceeds from something sacred. That money is now sacred, okay? So rather, the Mishnah must be referring to a case where they collected money to purchase a sacred object, and there was money left over after they made the purchase, okay? That's what we're talking about. In such a case, the reason that it is permitted to use the extra money for any purpose as the committee who collected the money sees fit is that they made an explicit stipulation and we're collecting money to purchase a Sefer Torah, and if there's extra money, we're going to use it for what the committee deems fit for the needs of the community, but not necessarily to purchase a sacred object. But if they didn't make such a stipulation, perhaps all of the funds collected did acquire sanctity and can only be used to purchase sacred items. Rava rejects this argument. Actually, you can explain that the Mishnah is referring to a case where they sold a sacred object and there was money left over after purchasing a new one. And this is what the Baraisa is saying. In what case is this statement of the Mishnah stated? In a case where the 7 representatives of the town did not explicitly stipulate that they could use the money as they see fit in an assembly of the residents of the town. However, if the 7 representatives of the town made such a stipulation in an assembly of the residents of the town, then even to use the money for a duchsusya would also be permitted, right? Because we saw that, if it's a town synagogue, so that you can't sell that because everyone in the town relies on that synagogue. But if the whole town basically agreed to sell the synagogue using, via their representatives, their elected representatives, and the representatives announced that we're going to sell this synagogue to the whole town in an assembly of the town, because they're going to build a new synagogue or because they don't need that synagogue, it's fallen into disuse, etc. They have the authority to do that. Now, when they say they're going to make that sale, they can say, okay, no, we're going to sell the synagogue in order to buy a new one. We're going to sell the Torah. We're going to sell the books of the prophets in order to buy a Sefer Torah. Okay. If there's money left over, what are we going to do with it? If they say we have the authority to sell these books and we're going to use the proceeds to buy something sacred, but leftover money we're going to do as seems fit for the needs of the community, that's okay. But if they don't make that stipulation, then because they sold a sacred item, all that money is sanctified and can only be used for other sacred items. Abaye said to one of the sages who would arrange the Mishnah before Rav Sheshes, did you hear anything from Rav Sheshes with regard to the meaning of the term duchsusya? Now that you're saying, okay, if they made that stipulation that leftover money, it can be used for non-sacred purposes, and it could even be used to fund the duchsusya. So what is a duchsusya? Right? The sages are asking the same question. What is a duchsusya? And he said, so Abaye questioned one of the sages who would arrange the Mishnah before Rav Sheshes. Did you hear from Rav Sheshes? What is a duchsusya? And this sage who knew Rav Sheshes, who worked with Rav Sheshes, said to Abaye, this is what Rav Sheshes said. It is the town horseman who would serve the townspeople as a sentry and for public dispatches. He was an employee of the town who would act as a guard of the town and as a herald of the town and to make announcements of the town. That he was an employee of the town. He wasn't necessarily doing anything sacred. So it's definitely something that serves communal needs, but not of a sanctified nature. Okay, the next section we're going to skip. It's a parenthetical comment. Now that we're talking about Abaye, we're going to learn a different teaching of Abaye, which has to do with collecting, that we're collecting money for communal purposes. What happens if you visit another town and while you're there, they make everybody in the town give money to charity for the needs of that town? But you're not a resident of that town. You're visiting that town. Do you have to give money for the needs of that town? An individual who goes to a different town and he pledges a sum to charity should give it to that town. Now, if many people can't come together, a bunch of people from our town as a group go visit that town. And while we're there, they make this collection for the needy people of that town. Okay, so we're all going to make a pledge, but can't we make our pledge be for money for the needs of the poor in our town, right? That's the question that's being asked. So if many people go together on a visit to that town, they should give the sum to the town's charity collector so that they are not suspected of reneging. But when they are ready to return home, the town collector should return the money to them, and they should take it home with them and then distribute to the poor of their own town. However, if there is a Torah scholar in the town that they're visiting, then under all circumstances, they should give the money to him, and he decides to whom the money should be given. And we see this even today, for instance, in Bnei Barak, which is a very, Hasidic town in Israel, where there's a bunch of rebbes, and huge numbers of Hasidim. And the rebbes, in addition to, giving spiritual counsel to all of their followers and leading prayers, etc., also are in charge of the charity collection. So, for example, the Biala Rebbe, when he visits LA and he collects funds for his yeshivas and orphanages and hospitals and all kinds of causes like that, right? So he's entrusted with all those charitable funds, as it should be, right? A great Torah leader is somebody who's also trusted to distribute, charity to the poor properly. So if you've got a person like that, so give the funds to him and then trust him to do what's right with it. And that brings us to the B side of page 27 and Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 4. They may not sell a sacred object belonging to the community to an individual, even if the object will still be used for the same sacred purpose, due to the fact that by doing so, they lessen the degree of sanctity, as an item that is used by fewer people is considered to have a lower degree of sanctity than one used by many, right? So if a community has a Sefer Torah in their synagogue, right, and for whatever reason they're going to need to sell that Sefer Torah or that book of prophets, and they're going to sell it to an individual who's a Torah scholar who's going to use that scroll to learn from, or right, but for his own use. So then you can't make that sale. You shouldn't sell a Torah scroll at all. But let's just say we're selling, another kind of book, but it's a holy book, and you're going to sell it from a community to an individual. Now he's going to use it for Torah study, just like the community was using it for Torah study. But one person using it for Torah study is considered a lesser degree of sanctity than a whole community using it. So you can't make that sale. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. The rabbis said to him, if so, by your logic, it should also not be permitted to sell a sacred object from a large town to a small town. However, such a sale is certainly permitted, and therefore it must also be permitted to sell such an object to an individual. And the Gemara asks, well, the rabbis are saying well to Rabbi Meir, as they provide a rational argument for their opinion. How could Rabbi Meir counter their claim? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Meir holds that when a sacred object is transferred from a large town to a small town, there is no significant downgrade in the degree of sanctity, as at the outset it was sacred for a community, and now too it is sacred for a community. But when it is transferred from a community to an individual, that's different. Community to community, whether it's a big one to a small or small to big, it's still community to community. But community to an individual, that is a downgrading of sanctity, and that should be prohibited. That's Rabbi Meir's view. And the rabbis, how could they respond to Rabbi Meir's claim? Since the rabbi's argument is, well, according to you, if just less people use it, that downgrades the sanctity, so then you also should prohibit big community to small community, and we don't prohibit that. So how could they respond to his claim? Well, if there is cause to be concerned about the decrease in the number of people who will use the object when it is transferred from a community to an individual, then in a case like this as well, where the object is transferred to a smaller community, there should be cause to be concerned about this due to the principle expressed in the verse, Proverbs 14:28, in the multitude of people is the king's glory. And the verse teaches that the larger the assembly involved in a mitzvah, the greater the honor to God. However, it is apparent that this principle does not prevent the sale of a synagogue to a smaller community, and therefore it should not prevent the selling of a synagogue to an individual. And that's where the Gemara stops. Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 4. They may sell a synagogue only with a stipulation that if the sellers so desire it, the buyers will return it to them. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis say they may sell a synagogue with a permanent sale for any usage except the following 4 things, which would be an affront to the synagogue's previous sanctity. Right? So what they're saying is, according to Rabbi Meir, if a community is forced to sell a synagogue for whatever reason, they've fallen on really hard times, they're going to sell their synagogue. But there's a chance that, money could come into the community, a rich guy could move there, somebody could receive a big inheritance, and then they could keep the synagogue going. So they should only sell it to a buyer who agrees that if they get a bunch of money and they can redeem it, they can repurchase their synagogue, he has to agree to sell it back to them. But the rabbis who overrule Rabbi Meir and say, no, you can make a permanent sale. The only condition when you're selling that synagogue is that it can't be used for one of these 4 uses, which would be an affront to the dignity of the fact that it used to be a synagogue. So you can't take a former synagogue and turn it into a bathhouse. You can't turn it into a place of a tannery, a leather tannery, because of the foul smell. They use urine and other products to tan the leather, and that would be an affront to the fact that it used to be a synagogue. You can't use that new place, that you can't use that former synagogue for immersion. You can't turn it into a mikvah because people will stand undressed in that place. Nor can you turn it into a public restroom. You can't turn it into a bathroom because that's gross to use a former synagogue as a bathroom. Rabbi Yehuda says they may sell a synagogue for the generic purpose of serving as a courtyard, and then the buyer may do with it as he wishes, even if that is one of the above 4 purposes. Now we're going to skip a little discussion that they have on this idea of Rabbi Meir that you can only sell it if the buyer promises that he'll sell it back to you in case you get the money together and you can buy it back. It's sort of like a pawn shop, right? The pawnbroker will give you the money, but you have the right to go in if you get the money back and buy your thing, right? But the problem with that is if you have a right to purchase it back for the same price that you sold it to the buyer, but meantime, the buyer was living there, for example. He was benefiting from the property. He wasn't just owning it, he was benefiting from it. So if he's going to give you money, right? He's going to buy the building from you. You're going to hold on to that money. And then you're going to pay him back, right? When you repurchase the building. And while you held the money, while he lent you the money, essentially, right? He lent you the money and then you paid it back, right? And then now you get the building back. But while the buyer is acting like a lender. And if he was benefiting from the building while that loan essentially was outstanding, then that's like getting interest. It's ribis, right? So like a Jew cannot lend money at interest to another Jew, right? That's what usury is, usury. That is prohibited by the Torah. You can't lend money to your fellow Jew and take interest for it. And this is one of those situations where it wasn't really a loan, but effectively, if the money went in one direction and then the same money went back, and while the money was outstanding, the one who purchased the building was then benefiting from it. Then when the money changes hands again, it's like he had the benefit of living there while the money was outstanding, and that's like taking interest, and that would be prohibited. And that's why they would prohibit that situation. But Rabbi Yehuda says there's no guarantee that building's ever going to be purchased back. So it might end up effectively being like interest, but it's uncertain interest, and that is not prohibited. And then the other rabbis will say, well, even uncertain interest is prohibited unless you made a stipulation that you would not only give the money back when you repurchase the building, but the guy who got a benefit from it while he was living in the synagogue during the time that he had bought it, he would actually then pay you the rent, the retroactive rent, for the value that he got out of it, so that there would be no even possibility of calling that interest. It was a side discussion. Now we skip forward a little bit for the last thing we're going to talk about today. The Mishna states, and the rabbis say, they may sell a synagogue with a permanent sale. However, it may not be sold if it will be used for activities that would be an affront to the synagogue's previous sanctity. And Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said, it is permitted for a person to urinate within 4 cubits of where one has just offered a prayer, i.e., one may urinate even in the same place that he prays. This is apropos of the idea that you can't sell a synagogue if it's going to become a bathroom. It was a place where people prayed, then it's going to become a bathroom. That's going to be a place where people urinate, and that would be an affront to the dignity of the synagogue. But as a proof of that, no, you can sell it even under those conditions. They're saying, well, in a place where you prayed, you should not urinate later. Now, certainly you can't pray in a place where people urinate. We learned that in Tractate Brachas, right? And even if you're there, you're praying, and then somebody comes by, it's like outdoors somewhere, and somebody comes by and urinates right near where you're praying, well, you have to move away from that place. You have to be at least 4 cubits distance from the place where that urine is on the ground, because you can't pray to God in a place, where there's something disgusting like that. So you move away. Well, what about a place where you're not praying anymore, but you did pray there? Can you later urinate there? That's the question being asked now. And Rabbi Yosef says, what is he teaching us? We already learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says they may sell a synagogue for the generic purpose of serving as a courtyard, and the buyer may then do with it as he wishes. And that means he could even make it into a lavatory. And even the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda say they are ruling only with regard to a synagogue whose sanctity is permanent. However, with regard to the 4 cubits where one happened to stand in prayer, some spot outdoors whose sanctity is not permanent, no, even the rabbis would be lenient. And a Tana taught a Baraisa before Rav Nachman, one who prayed should distance himself 4 cubits from where he was standing, and only then may he urinate. So that would indicate that, well, the fact that you prayed in this spot sort of gave some kind of sanctity to that place, and you shouldn't then urinate in that place later, even after you finish praying. You should distance yourself from the place where you prayed. Rav Nachman said to him, granted, the second clause of the Baraisa, that one who urinated should distance himself 4 cubits and only then may he pray, that makes sense. We learned that in Tractate Brachos on 22b. And how far must a person distance himself from urine and from excrement before he prays? 4 cubits. But the first clause of the Baraisa, that one who prayed should distance himself 4 cubits from where he was standing and only then may he urinate, why should I require this? How could there be such a law? If that is so, you have sanctified all the streets of Nehardea, the town in the Babylonian Jewish community. For people have certainly prayed on every one of its streets. Therefore, nobody could urinate on any one of those streets, right? Apparently, there was a lot of outdoor urination going on in that town. And you would say, well, since people prayed everywhere there, they would have to completely leave the town and go somewhere outside the town before they could find a place to pee. According to this law, it should be prohibited to urinate everywhere in that town. The Gemara answers, actually amend, change, and teach the Baraisa as saying, not that one should distance himself 4 cubits from a place where he prayed before he urinates, but rather one should wait the time that it takes to walk 4 cubits before he urinates. You are praying. Before you go pee, even if you really have to go badly, you should at least wait the amount of time that it takes to walk 4 cubits. That's not a lot of time. That's 2 steps. Okay, but take a break before, take a breath before you go and do your thing. And the Gemara addresses the amended version of the Baraisa. Granted, its second clause that one who urinated waits the time it takes to walk 4 cubits and only then may he pray. Okay, that makes sense. This is due to the droplets of urine that may still be issuing from him. He should wait until they cease entirely. However, with regard to the first clause that one who prayed should wait the time it takes to walk 4 cubits and only then may he urinate, Why should I require this? And Rav Ashi said, because for all the time that it takes to walk 4 cubits, his prayer is still arranged in his mouth and his lips are still articulating them. Like you're still involved in your prayer for a few breaths before you go to the bathroom. Make sure you make a separation between the holy time you spend praying and then the time you spend attending to your physical needs. Okay, and we're going to stop there. Where we're going to pick it up tomorrow is that one of the rabbis says because he always was careful to separate where he prays from where he attends to his needs and vice versa, that is why he merited to live a long life. And apropos that teaching, we're going to go into a whole series of beautiful teachings of sages who lived for a long time and attribute their long lives to particular practices that they were very careful about during their lives. That's what we're going to be covering tomorrow. It's going to be a beautiful, beautiful series of teachings on page 28 of Tractate Megillah. Okay, I'll make a note Monday. Let's pick it up there. All right, let's see. Do we have comments or questions? Oh, excuse me. My Kleenexes are caught together. 1 second, please. Okay. Christo. For the Pasul Torah, the disqualified Torah that somehow became old and can no longer be used, the Pasul Torah that's sold, could such a Torah be kept on display in a respectful manner as a way of educating people about the Torah and Judaism? Kind of wish my synagogue had one on display somewhere in a reverent setting so I could show non-Jewish guests, as it could be a great learning opportunity. I think, yeah. I mean, I'm not a rabbi, I'm not sure. But like what we know is what you can't do is take an old Pasul Torah that's no longer qualified for use for public reading and throw it out, right? It needs to be buried. But to just display it in a respectful manner as an educational tool seems to me like that would be a great idea, because that now it's being given kavod, it's being given honor. It's not being used for public reading, but it is still serving Torah study. Seems like that would be a great idea. I'm not sure, but I like the idea. Sharon, can you switch Torah covers between Torahs that are both being actively in use? Now that came up, and I was thinking the same thing, Sharon. It says that you can take wrapping cloths, and they can go up in sanctity, right? From a book of the prophets to a single book of the Torah, from a single book of the Torah to a complete Sefer Torah. Can you switch the mantles from one Torah to another? I don't know. I mean, it would seem like that should be allowed, but it's not going up in sanctity. But they were really using that teaching for the proof on the question of can you sell one Torah to buy another. I'm not sure about the mantle. We know that a single Torah can have multiple mantles, right? The cover, because we have the regular cover for the rest of the year, and then the white cover that we use during Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. But it's like that, that cloth was specific to a Torah. Could it be used for a different Torah? I just don't know offhand, but it's a great question. Sharon, many shuls have siddur funds. To dedicate a siddur, a prayer book, one pays an amount more than the cost of the siddur to raise funds. Is this acceptable in accordance with this Mishna? Yes, because they stipulated that the funds that they're raising, it's a fundraiser for the synagogue, right? So it's known to the people what the funds are being used for from the get-go. Right. Plus, it seems like they were pretty clear that even without that stipulation, at least on some of the opinions, the fact that that money never acquired sanctity. If you sold prayer books, okay, that money could only be used for something of at least of greater sanctity for sure, maybe of equal sanctity. Now we're not so sure about that question. But if you are using it as a fundraiser, then everybody knows that it's being used as a fundraiser. Yosef, I'm sure in some of these instances of buying and selling holy items, there was some level of distrust and corruption in some cases. Hard to imagine, but it does happen. in this case, let's say usury, how then would the authorities in charge deal with such a dishonest businessman? You're asking me as a matter of like a practical matter, if people committed a fraud, in buying and selling sacred items and kept something for themselves. I mean, that's a big avera, right? So that person committed a sin for sure. It's a sin against God. Is it also going to be punishable by the earthly court? Probably. I mean, in ancient times, at least lashes. If they stole from the congregation, that's theft, and they would have to, return what they stole plus at least 20%. And they would administer lashes. What they didn't have is prison. They either had lashes or, death sentence or excommunication. They didn't use jail. That was not one of their punishments. But good question. Karen, isn't there something somewhere that says a community needs to prioritize having a mikveh before anything else? Yes, right. So that a community has to have the mikveh so that the husbands and wives can be permitted to each other, right? Like before they build a synagogue, they could just pray in somebody's house. They can pray in somebody's backyard, and we have backyard minions now all the time. But if they don't have a mikveh, if they don't have a kosher butcher, then they really have problems, right? So a community that's forming has to have a mikveh. What they're saying, though, is you can't turn a synagogue into a mikveh because in the place where people prayed and where Torah scrolls were displayed for public reading, that can't become a place where people are going to be walking around naked later. Michael, we were told by the rabbinical court we could not sell our shul, our synagogue, to someone who owns a church, as they may use our shul for a Christian church. What does the Gemara say? But that was not one of the 4 prohibited uses, right? It was not you couldn't use that as a tannery, couldn't be a lavatory, couldn't be a mikveh, and what was the fourth one? A bathhouse, right? So, and Bill shared with us that there was a former synagogue in Berkeley that now is used by Franciscan friars as a place for them. So I'm sure there's a church as part of their abbey, right? So it seems like that's not going to be one of these triggering things. Plus, you could sell that building, right, and just to the buyer is going to use it as a courtyard, and then it's not like, we're putting some kind of a lien on it, a restriction that till the end of time it can never be used for one of those purposes. You just can't, the first buyer can't be telling the sellers that it's going to be for something like that. Ideally, you want to sell it for something that's consistent with the ideals of the former synagogue. Ideally, it's just not always going to be possible, especially a synagogue that's no longer in use or a synagogue that's moving across town, etc. And finally, Sharon, is the need for distance between bathroom breaks and prayer sites, does that apply to all prayer, including the Shema, Hamita, Asher Yatzar, etc.? It seems like we're talking probably about, when we talk about the prayer, right, the Amidah, the standing prayer. And there was a little bit of a discussion there, like the Shema, you can just move. Like you're saying the Shema and then somebody comes along and urinates near you, you could just get up and move. But if you're reciting the Amidah, like you're not supposed to move from the place that you are. But now suddenly there's some filth in front of you. And so at least according to some opinions, you can move. But like, for example, you're talking about Asher Yatzar, the bathroom blessing. Like after we go to the bathroom, we say, blessed are you, Lord our God. It's well known before the throne of glory that you created the human body, and it's a beautiful, construction. Filled with passages and openings, and if but one of them were to be ruptured or but one of them were to be blocked, it would be impossible to stand before you for even 1 second. Blessed are you, Lord, who creates wonders. It's a beautiful prayer that we say right after we go to the bathroom, whether number 1 or number 2. Do we say it in the bathroom? No, we do not. We distance ourselves from the bathroom when we say that blessing. So we always want to make that transfer, have that break, and distance ourselves, if not physically 4 cubits, than at least the amount of time that it takes to walk 4 cubits. But like I said, that's 4 cubits is 6 feet. It's just 2 steps. It's not that ornery of a requirement, so we should definitely do our best to honor it. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Pacific, the regular time, for this amazing series of teachings about why it is that certain sages merited a long life. Good night.